which is a white substance, but which immediately becomes black when acted upon by the rays near the violet extremity of the spectrum. This substance, however, highly susceptible as it is of having its color affected by light, is, nevertheless, found not to be changed in any sensible degree when exposed to the light of the moon, even when that light is condensed by the most powerful burning lenses." End quote. The sun's light, when concentrated by a number of mirrors or a large burning lens, produces a focus which is entirely non-luminous, but in which the heat is so great that metallic and alkaline substances are quickly fused. Earthy and mineral compounds almost immediately vitrified, and all animal and vegetable structures in a few seconds burned up and destroyed. But the moon's light is so concentrated, produces a brilliant focus, so luminous that it's difficult to look upon it, and yet there is no increase of temperature. Quote, "If the most delicate thermometer be exposed to the full light of the moon, shining with its greatest luster, the mercury is not elevated a hair's breadth. Neither would it be if exposed to the focus of her rays concentrated by the most powerful lenses. This has been proved by actual experiment." End quote. Quote, "This question has been submitted to the test of direct experiment. The bulb of a thermometer sufficiently sensitive to render apparent change of temperature amounting to the thousandth part of a degree was placed in the focus of a concave reflector of vast dimensions, which being directed to the moon, the lunar rays were collected with great power upon it." These quotes are from All the Year Round by Dickens. Not the slightest change, however, was produced in the thermometric column, proving that a concentration of rays sufficient to fuse gold if they proceeded from the sun does not produce a change of temperature so great as the thousandth part of a degree when they proceed from the moon. End quote. Quote, "The light from the moon, though concentrated by the most powerful burning lens available at the time, is incapable of raising the temperature of the most delicate thermometer. M. de la Hire collected the rays of the full moon when on the meridian by means of burning glass 35 inches in diameter, and made them fall on the bulb of a delicate air thermometer. No effect was produced, though the lunar rays by this glass were concentrated 300 times. End quote. Quote, "Professor Forbes concentrated the moon's light by a lens 30 inches in diameter, its focal distance being about 41 inches, and having a power of concentration exceeding 6,000 times. The image of the moon, which was only 18 hours past full, and less than 2 hours from the meridian, was brilliantly thrown by this lens on the extremity of a commodious thermopile. Although the observations were made in the most unexceptional manner, and supposing that half the rays were reflected, dispersed, and absorbed, though the light of the moon was concentrated," this quote is from Dr. Lardner's Museum of Science, page 115, "though the light of the moon was concentrated 3,000 times, not the slightest thermo effect was produced." In the so-called Lancet, or medical journal, for March 14, 1856, particulars are given of several experiments which proved that the moon's rays, when concentrated, actually reduced the temperature upon a thermometer more than 8 degrees. Quote, "The cold, chaste moon, the queen of heaven, bright isles, who makes all beautiful, on which she smiles, that wandering shrine of soft yet icy flame, which ever is transformed, yet still the same, and warms but not illumes." Shelley. The so-called pale cold moon is an expression not only beautifully poetic, but evidently true philosophically. If, as we have now seen, the very nature of a reflector demands certain conditions, and the moon does not manifest these conditions, it must of necessity be concluded that the moon is not a reflector, but a self-luminous body. If self-luminous, her surface could not be darkened or eclipsed by a shadow of the earth. Supposing such were thrown upon it, the luminosity, instead of being diminished, would be greater in proportion to the greater density, or, previous quotes from Dr. Noad's lectures on chemistry, page 334, greater in proportion to the greater density or darkness of the shadow. As the light in a lantern shines most brightly in the darkest places, so would the moon's self-luminous surface be most intense in the deepest part of the Earth's shadow. It is thus rendered undeniable that a lunar eclipse does not and could not arise from a shadow of the Earth. As a solar eclipse occurs from the moon passing over the sun, so, from the evidence it is clear that a lunar eclipse can only arise from a similar cause. A body semi-transparent and well-defined passing before the moon or between her surface and the observer on the surface of the Earth. That such a body exists is admitted by several distinguished astronomers. In the report of the Council of the Royal Astronomical Society for June 1850, it is stated, quote, "We may well doubt whether that a body which we call the moon is the only satellite of the Earth," end quote. In the report of the Academy of Sciences for October 12, 1846, and again for August 1847, the director of one of the French observatories gives a number of observations and calculations which have led him to conclude that, quote, "There is at least one non-luminous body of considerable magnitude which is attached as a satellite to this Earth." End quote. Persons who are unacquainted with the methods of calculating eclipses and other foresaid quote referred to in Lardner's quote Museum of Science, page 159. Persons who are unacquainted with the methods of calculating eclipses and other astronomical phenomena are prone to look upon the correctness of these calculations as powerful arguments in favor of the doctrine of the Earth's rotundity and the Newtonian philosophy, generally speaking. But this is erroneous. Whatever theory is adopted, or if all theories are discarded, the same results may follow because the necessary data may be tabulated and employed independently of all theory, or may be mixed up with any, even the most opposite doctrines, or kept distinct from every system, just as the operator may decide. The tables of the moon's relative positions for almost any second of the time are purely practical, the result of long continued observation, and may or may not be mixed up with the hypothesis. In Smith's quote, "Rise and Progress of Astronomy," end quote, speaking of Ptolemy, who lived in the 2nd century of the Christian era, it is said, quote, "The considered defects of his system did not prevent him from calculating all the eclipses that were to happen from 600 years to come," end quote. Professor Partington, at page 370 of his lectures on natural philosophy, says, quote, "The most ancient observations of which we are in possession that are sufficiently accurate to be employed in astronomical calculations are those made at Babylon about 719 years before the Christian era, of 3 eclipses of the moon. Ptolemy, who has transmitted them to us, employed them for determining the period of the moon's mean motion, and therefore had probably none more ancient on which he could depend. The Chaldeans, however, must have made a long series of observations before they could discover their Saros, or lunar period, of 6,585 1/3 days, or about 18 years, at which time, as they had learnt, the place of the moon, her node and apogee, returned nearly to the same situation with respect to the earth and sun, and of course a series of nearly similar eclipses occur." End quote. Sir Richard Phillips, in his quote, "Millions of Facts," at page 388 says, quote, "The procession of astronomy arises not from theories but from prolonged observations, and the regularity of the motions, or the ascertained uniformity of their irregularities. Ephemerides of the planets' places, of eclipses, etc., have been published for over 300 years and were nearly as precise as at present. End quote. Quote, these are coming from Somerville's Physical Sciences, page 46. Quote, no particular theory is required to calculate the eclipses, and the calculations may be made with equal accuracy independent of every theory. End quote. End of section 9. Section 10. The doctrine of the Earth's rotundity being fallacious, all ideas of, quote, center of attraction of gravitation, or mutual attraction of Earth and Moon, etc., must be given up, and the cause of tides in the ocean must be sought for in another direction. It is certain that there is a constant pressure of the atmosphere upon the surface of the earth and ocean. This is proved by ordinary barometrical observations, many pneumatic experiments, and by the fact that during the most fearful storms at sea, the surface only is disturbed. At the depth of 100 feet, the water is always calm, except in the path of well-marked currents and local submarine phenomenon. The following quotations gathered from casual reading fully corroborate this statement. Quote, it is amazing how superficial is the most terrible tempest. Divers assure us that the greatest storm's calmer water is found at the depths of 90 feet. End quote. Chambers Journal, number 100, page 379. Quote, this motion of the surface of the sea is not perceptible to a great depth. In the strongest gale, it is supposed not to extend beyond 72 feet below the surface, and at the depth of 90 feet, the sea is perfectly still. End quote. Quote, the people are under great mistake who believe that the substance of the water moves to any considerable depth in a storm at sea. It is only the form or shadow which hurries along like a spirit or like a thought over the countenance of the great deep, at the rate of some 40 miles an hour. Even when the Flying Dutchman is abroad, the great mass of water continues undisturbed and nearly motionless a few feet below the surface. End quote. The unabraded appearance of the shells brought up from great depths, and the almost total absence of the mixture of any detritus form of the sea or foreign matter suggest most forcibly the idea of a perfect repose at the bottom of the deep sea. End quote. Bearing this fact in mind, that there exists a continual pressure of the atmosphere upon the earth, and associating it with the fact that the earth is a vast plain, quote, stretched out upon the waters, end quote, and it will be seen that it must of necessity slightly fluctuate, or slowly rise and fall in the water, as by the action of the, quotes coming from Penny Cyclopedia, Article C, that's SEA, London Saturday Journal, August 8, 1840, page 71. Physical Geography of the Sea by Lieutenant Maury, page 265. As by the action of the atmosphere, the earth is slowly depressed. The water moves towards the receding shores and produces the flood tide. And when by the reaction of the resisting oceanic medium, the earth gradually ascends, the waters recede, and the ebb tide is produced. This is the general cause of the tides. Whatever peculiarities are observable, they may be traced to the reaction of channels, bays, headlands, and other local causes. If a raft or ship or any other structure floating upon water be carefully observed, it will be seen to have a gentle fluctuating motion. However calm the water and the atmosphere may be, this gradual rising and falling of the floating mass is always more or less observable. If vessels of different sizes are floating near each other, they will be seen to fluctuate with different velocities. The largest and heaviest will move the least rapidly. This motion will be observable whether the vessels be held by their anchors, or moored to buoys, or freely floating in the still water. A large and heavily laden vessel will make several fluctuations in a minute of time, the earth once only in about 12 hours, because it is proportionately larger. To this simple condition of the earth, the action or pressure upon it of the atmosphere, and the reaction or resistance to it of the water, may be traced all the leading peculiarities of the tides.